All right, so being invited, as I said, to speak at Oxford is a little intimidating because it's like I have to go pretend to be a real scholar. And so just by way of kind of priming this crowd, because I assume the crowd in Oxford might have a little bit more background with Tolkien. He wrote a story called, or an essay lecture called On Fairy Stories. And it's really good. It's basically Tolkien's analysis of what he calls fairy stories, because he doesn't like the term fairy tale for these, because that's a certain subset. And it's kind of a defense of fiction written as for entertainment and escapism, and what the value of that is, and what defines a thing as a fairy story. He did this because, in part, like the term fantasy, it had started to gain traction, but it hadn't really gained traction. And fantasy and fairy stories are not the same thing, right? Fairy stories are a subset of fantasy, but where you specifically go visit fairy and meet with like elf lords and things like that. And so my essay is kind of like I'm calling it On Fantasy, and it is looking at the history of the fantasy genre, the innovations Tolkien made, and kind of what we can learn from it. It's an amalgamation of many things I've thought about for many years. So here we go. Rough draft. It's too long. I need to trim it, but it might. I'm supposed to speak 45 minutes there. We might go a little longer than that. Around 85 years ago, Professor Tolkien wrote the initial drafts of his essay On Fairy Stories, one of the foundational texts about the nature of fantasy as a genre. He hadn't finished Lord of the Rings yet, and The Hobbit was only a year too old at that point, but he already was building a framework for defining the subgenre he was pioneering. Fantasy was not new in 1938. It can be argued that the genre is as old as storytelling is. Even the term fantasy, in relationship to the genre, was not new. George MacDonald is the first to popularize it with his book, Fantasies, spelled with a PH, in 1858, almost a century before Tolkien. However, something different happened with the publication of The Hobbit, and more importantly, The Lord of the Rings. I'd like to speak on that today, the innovations that Tolkien made, how they spawned a new subgenre, and why fantasy stories are still relevant today. Consider this as a kind of generational retrospective on fairy stories, with an eye toward doing something dangerous, defining what a fantasy story even is. So, limitations. The invitation to lecture here in this prestigious historic location cannot help but make a person question his own credentials. I think a great deal about the genre we inherited from Professor Tolkien, but while I am a reader and lover of these stories, I am not a true scholar of them. That said, I'm encouraged by the fact that Tolkien in his essay said something similar about himself. And I do hazard to guess that I've spent more time than anyone in the wilderness that is the outreaches, or more time than anyone in the wilderness that is the outreaches of this genre, wrestling with what portions of it can be cultivated. Fantasy is, at its most base, defined as a genre where anything can happen. For large stretches of history, it was primarily an oral medium, stories told to fascinate and delight, imagined on the spot. It is a genre of the fairy story, the myth, and the tall tale. As I mentioned earlier, it is a wilderness of untamed possibility, where anything can grow. And walking those wilds, you will find wonder and awe in abundance, but not really structure. Indeed, it could be argued that fantasy is antithetical to structure. How do you define or encapsulate the infinite, the horizon, tantalizing, daring us to stretch a little further so that we might catch the briefest glimpse of their majesty among the shifting and obscuring mist? Yet this, as a literary genre, is what fantasy must be. I think I need to change that. Yeah. See, this is why we're doing this.
One take live.
Right, yeah.
You realize you guys are all beta readers now, right?
You are. Beta listeners. Okay. Yet structure for a literary genre is something fantasy must have. To tell a story that lasts, that fills pages of a novel in a satisfying and profound way, we must impose bounds on the boundless. We must stop at some place upon that horizon and explore what we have, striving to find the story among storied ideas. Fortunately, imaginations are like fractals. They express more and more detail the closer you look at them. Slice off a piece of infinity, and that piece itself will become infinite. Not mathematically, but conceptually for us writers. The mathematicians hate when I talk like that. As authors, we don't seek to constrain imagination, merely harness it. To this end, and in striving to understand just what Tolkien accomplished and how we can learn from it, I'm going to put a few definitions in place. What is fantasy? 3 definitions. First off, fantasy is fiction. This is the first and most important rule for our definitions. Fantasy must be a story that was imagined as fiction, presented as a fiction, and accepted as fiction. Without this rule, we have no genre. It's not within the scope of this lecture to posit on the nature of religion or deity, but surely we must agree that the Bible, the Quran, and the Upanishads are attempting to do something very different from Lord of the Rings. A fantasy story might imagine deities, but they are fictional deities, presented without calls to faith or adulation. They can be metaphors or allegories, sorry, Professor Tolkien, for real-world religion. He hated allegory. For real-world religion, but their context must be fictional. Aslan is not Jesus Christ. Eru Iluvatar is not Elohim, right? They might be metaphors for that, but they're not. This leads to our first big problem defining which works are fantasy works. Is the Odyssey a fantasy? Did Homer take what he believed was an oral tradition of actual events and dramatize them, which would make a historical fiction? Did his audience believe these were the actions of actual gods, or was this all a metaphor and an entertaining fiction? It gets more difficult even than the Odyssey. If we look at something like Beowulf or the Epic of Gilgamesh, where we have less context, right? What of the fairy stories that Tolkien so loved? How many of the people telling them believed in those fairies? To them was the tale of an elf king a historical fiction with imagined characters in a real-life setting. I believe intent is important, and I cannot categorize most works existing before the 1800s as being fantasy. I can call them proto-fantasies. I can say they might have been fantasies. I cannot, for instance, 100% say, 100% sure, I can't be 100% sure whether Shakespeare believed that the ghost of a dead father would and could return to give warning to a princely son, right? However, this problem does lead us to our second definition. So, definition 1, for it to be fantasy, it has to be fiction, intended as fiction. But for the second definition, fantasy must be impossible. In his essay, Tolkien seeks to define the fairy story and rejects most common definitions. Fortunately, the great philologist himself was handy with the definition. To him, a fairy story is a story about the land of fairy, the place specifically. Fantasy, in turn, is not about a place. It's about an alternate possibility, a world where the impossible in our world becomes possible in theirs. Magic, it could be said, is central to this. The dividing line between science fiction and fantasy is a vague one, a contested border, it could be said, with armies camped on either side and seizing ground back and forth as subgenres, and these days, internet trope tags, are seized and relinquished like banners. However, if we were to offer a treaty between the two, I consider science fiction to be the realm of the plausible, and fantasy to be the realm of the impossible. This isn't a perfect definition. Unlike science, which can measure the weight of an atom, we cannot strictly measure words, for they represent ideas. And ideas, as we've established, are boundless nuggets of possibility, always yearning for the horizon. Some stories will stubbornly refuse our boxes, and that's all right, because we have one final definition that is a catch-all. So number 3, third, fantasy uses fantasy aesthetics. New is not new Unix. You might find this recursive. What good, you might say, is a definition that contains a reference to itself? In this final definition, I must give obeisance to the fact that fiction is an art and not a science. How do we tell Art Nouveau from Art Deco? Well, for most of
Elves
us,
and dwarves.
we look at it and say, it feels like Art Nouveau. Now, mark me here. I'm not saying that So, I skipped the line. We look at it and measure which aesthetic it's using. Same for genres. Now, mark me here. I'm not saying that fantasy must use elves, knights, or castles. However, barring an intentional desire to hide its subgenre, a fantasy story presents itself as a fantasy story. It doesn't say that magic is actually the careful, deceitful application of science, as that science is understood in our world. Fantasy leans into, but isn't limited to, certain emotional experiences. Exploration, a sense of wonder, the visiting of a place where the rules you expect no longer work, and new rules must be presented. It can be horrifying, with the magic at dark and ominous unknown. It can engage the problem-solving parts of our brains by presenting new branches of physics impossible in our world, with characters who explore them in that world. It can travel to Middle-earth or take you to a pub in London where everything is the same at its core. However, it is trying to go someplace impossible to bring you to a familiarity with its ways. Now, at the end of this, you might ask, what about insert story set in space with fantasy elements? You know the ones I'm talking about. Are those fantasy or science fiction? The answer is yes. That's my answer. Star Wars is both. It's a fantasy story and a science fiction story, right? Just like Lord of the Rings is both a fantasy story and a war epic. Just like Narnia is both a fantasy story and a Christian allegory. Just like Mistborn is both a fantasy story and a heist. A story is never just one genre. So now we have our definition, right? Fiction, it's the impossible, and it deliberately leans into fantasy aesthetic. So what kinds of stories was the fantasy world regularly telling before The Hobbit, and more importantly, Lord of the Rings was released? And how did Tolkien create a new subgenre? So, 2 pillars of fantasy. Variety 1, the portal fantasy. The most common variety of fantasy tale in the 1800s and early 1900s, when this genre came of age, is the classic portal fantasy. These are stories about a person from the mundane world who finds some sort of gateway or portal or strange passage into the world of fantasy. They explore it, find it fraught with danger and wonder, and then, hopefully for them, return to the mundane world. The most famous example, early example of this is 1865's Alice Adventures in Wonderland, kind of the progenitor in commercial fiction of the portal fantasy. It certainly meets our definition. It's fiction, intended as a tale for children. It's impossible, full of potions and vanishing cats. And last of all, it paints with the colors of fantastical whimsy. However, it's not the first of its kind. Tolkien himself, as a youth, was fond of George MacDonald's Fantasies, though he later found it a little too moralizing. Tolkien had a thing about moralizing. This book from 1858 is largely celebrated as the first true fantasy novel, though there is one earlier, about a man who discovers the existence of fairyland and travels there. These stories owe a lot to the classical fairy tale, a distinct subset of the fairy story that Professor Tolkien lectured upon. While the portal in these early stories is often less distinct, involving a trip into the darkest woods, for example, they have the same hallmarks of what would become Alice's Adventures, Narnia, and Harry Potter from our modern age. Though many of the most famous portal fantasies are for children, they don't have to be. In fact, I'd argue that the modern urban fantasy is a variant of the portal fantasy with some horror elements as well, where one often finds an alternate world not by a dream or by a fairy ring, but by doors in a dark alleyway full of orcs drinking ale. Or, you know, they're modern, so they're not ale. They're modern, somebody who drinks...
Beer.
There you are. You fill it in for me. Yeah. The portal fantasy has remained a vibrant, popular pillar of the fantasy genre from its inception, with roots in mythological and religious texts, like Dante's Inferno, or classical Greek descents into the underworld. However, there is a second fantasy variant that is just as old, and one that Professor Tolkien himself was quite fond of studying. That is the heroic fantasy. So, variety 2, heroic fantasy. Heroic fantasy is that genre popularized by Robert E. Howard's Conan stories, but which has its roots in the heroic epics. Beowulf, dear to Professor Tolkien's heart, is the example, though of course, time has lost to us even the name of the Beowulf poet, leaving us with only imagination as to the great Scot's intentions with their poems. A heroic fantasy is that variety of story that traces the larger-than-life exploits of a heroic figure, facing incredible odds. Normally, the hero defeats these foes with sword and muscle in a low magic setting where wizards are conniving foes and spells are never to be used without fear that they will turn against you. It can be argued that the first of this subgenre to actively target a mature audience, while many of the... It can be argued that this was the first subgenre of fantasy to actively target a mature audience. While many of the early entries, such as John Carter, which are also portal fantasies at the same time, maintain a bombastic pace, there's often a gritty realism to them. A contrast to the often surreal fairy stories or the whimsical portal fantasies written for children. In heroic fantasy, people die in brutal ways. The hero is not guaranteed victory. He or she might be larger than life in many ways, but is still often a lone warrior against the might of nations. There's a sense of desperation, fear, and even melancholy to these stories. One curious aspect to a lot of the early heroic fantasies is their connection to our world. Secondary world fantasies did exist, but they were very rare. Conan, if you don't know, was set in the prehistory of our world, and John Carter was set on Mars, but he started on Earth. Once Tolkien popularized the secondary world, however, many later examples transitioned to use that same technology. Fritz Leiber, David Gemmell, Michael Moorcock, and the most popular modern example of the heroic fantasy, my friend Joe Abercrombie. So, this is Tolkien's day. When Tolkien sat down to write that infamous first line of The Hobbit in 1930, this was the environment. Oz, Conan, and the Barsoom books were the dominant forms of fantasy. And even they seemed kind of niche. There wouldn't be a fully recognized fantasy book on the bestseller list until almost 50 years later, Sword of Shannara. With the release of Sword of Shannara, fantasy was seen as a genre for children or the childlike. We all know what happened as Tolkien rebuilt and restructured not only fantasy but the book industry as a whole. Publishers sat around scratching their heads as a sequel trilogy to a niche children's book became the most exciting book phenomenon since Agatha Christie. We aren't here to simply laud Professor Tolkien, however, but to analyze what he did and how it created a third pillar of the fantasy genre, the pillar we have come to call epic fantasy. So, the third pillar, epic fantasy. I feel that Tolkien made 5 key innovations that together created the epic fantasy subgenre, which to this day remains a major force in the book industry. Now, to give due consideration to Tolkien's contemporaries, nothing on this list was created whole cloth by him. He was part of a conversation, a dialogue, and as many artists knows, nobody, no matter how brilliant, sits in a room without any influences and makes something great. Tolkien is not the first to do a secondary world fantasy. That distinction is largely credited to Phantasmion by Sarah Coleridge, who back in 1837 was laying the groundwork for modern fantasy and deserves every bit of credit for her imaginative and shockingly prescient writing. Tolkien was not the first to build immersion in a story, including in-world artifacts and ephemera. Dracula, for instance, was using in-world journals to tell its story before Tolkien made The Hobbit into a relic discovered and translated into English. However, the same can be said of Einstein, whose theory of relativity was greatly influenced and accelerated by the work of his contemporaries and forerunners. We do not need to exaggerate and say that Tolkien invented everything ex nihilo or fully formed like Athena springing from the mythological forehead. It is the assemblage of these ideas into a cohesive whole which created the subgenre. So, in innovation 1, sincerity. I have nothing against the whimsical fantasy. I enjoy that style of story as much as anyone, and I've even written a few myself. However, I feel the first thing Tolkien did was present an unabashedly serious work in what was considered by many an unserious genre. As I grew up as part of Generation X, and we are the generation of nerds who grew up being told that we should be ashamed of what we love. While my wonderful parents were encouraging, media and society in general presented nerdiness as childish at best, cringeworthy at worst. You can see this in my generation's humor, commonly seen in the Marvel or recent Star Wars films, where sincere moments are often undercut by a quick joke. We have trouble admitting, even 3 decades later, that we love what we love, and often feel that we need to hide or bury the sincere moments in our media. As if to say, hey, you didn't think I actually thought this was cool, do you? I find it nothing less than incredible that Tolkien didn't ever do this. Here was this distinguished professor, a veteran soldier, a scholar of the English language, and he unabashedly created the first epic fantasy story full of heart, warmth, heroism, and most of all, sincerity. There is levity in Lord of the Rings, certainly, but it's the levity of friends relaxing after a difficult phase of their journey. There isn't a single moment where Tolkien winks at us. Or more inspiring to me, he never acted the least bit ashamed of what he was doing. In fact, he was a staunch defender of and advocate for these kinds of stories. In the early to mid-2000s, J.K. Rowling gave a series of interviews, including one with Time magazine and another with the New York Times, where she talked about how little she liked the fantasy genre. She didn't read it, she thinks it's cliche, and prefers more quote-unquote serious works. This is a common theme among some authors of our genre. They so desperately want the approval of traditionally serious genres that they feel the need to distance themselves from the rest of us. Never Tolkien. His characters were authentic, his story is sincere, and his love of this genre is genuine. The world could dismiss the rest of us, but not the stubborn Oxford professor who refused to back down and bow before more popular academic trends. This is the first item that made Lord of the Rings shine, and you can feel it reading his books. He loved this world, and he was sincere. Innovation 2, magic. In On Fairy Stories, Tolkien is insistent that magic must be taken seriously. While a story can be satirical, the magic must not be for it to work as a fairy story. Magic in stories is of personal and artistic interest to me. I'm credited with popularizing the terms hard and soft magic, though I honestly can't remember if I came up with them or if I just heard them somewhere. People often mistake me for preferring hard magic systems, where the rules are concrete and the characters can therefore use their magical skills to problem solve. However, my actual preference is for stories to know how to best use their tools, whether that tool be a hard magic system or a soft one, or in the case of Lord of the Rings, both at the same time. When I initially began working on the speech, this was the item I intended to explore most. I half imagined that I'd be here today lecturing for an hour exclusively on Tolkien's use of magic. Though I eventually decided to expand the scope of the lecture, this is the ember that started the fire. Middle-earth is old, older than men, older than elves. The songs that the Iluvatar sing are one part magic, one part art, one part dream. The goal of this essay is not to delve into these deepest parts of the legendarium. Rather, I want to look at the practical use of magic in Lord of the Rings and how it works not from a lore perspective, but rather how it works as a nuts and bolts narrative level. Magic in early heroic fantasy is something to fear, or something that can never be controlled or used without danger. Magic in early portal fantasies was likewise often something of fairy, and gifted by gods or fated humans to use. A magical weapon, a potion, an incantation used exactly at the right moment might let the hero survive if they do it right. Magic in Tolkien is something else. It is approachable and usable. It maybe isn't fully understandable, at least not by the hobbits who provide our window into the greater Middle-earth, but neither is it strictly fearsome. When crossing the ford of Bruin, how do I say it? Tolkien scholars, how do I say the ford? I'll look this up before I say it. Right? Bruinen. Is it Bruinen? Yeah, there we are. The ford of Bruinen. It is Gandalf and Elrond whose magic to cause the swelling river to wash away the Nazgul. When Old Man Willow uses a somewhat classical fairy-inspired glamour to lure the hobbits to sleep, Tom Bombadil proves his power over nature and the fairy realm in releasing them. What is most interesting to me in scenes like this is how approachable Gandalf, Tom Bombadil, and Elrond are. Even in Arthurian lore, magic is often presented as something, if not terrifying, a dangerous and mysterious art. Merlin is himself arcane, mysterious, and what he does sometimes considered unnatural for a good Christian king to associate with. Yeah, somehow he's Christian, even though he lived before Christ. At least before Christianity got there, but lore. Arthurian lore. We're not here to talk too much about that. But Merlin is often presented as half demon. And though he's good, he's enigmatic and sometimes even presented as a wild man from the dark parts of the forest. Or, if you will, from the fairy realm. In contrast, Gandalf is a genuine friend to the hobbits. While he is stern at times, he's way more stern in the books. Ian McKellen's just too nice. It's a realistic human kind of grouchiness that he displays. He gets annoyed, tired, confused. but is also valiant, devoted, and nurturing. Though Maiar, like Merlin, a creation from beyond this realm, Gandalf is strikingly human. In Lord of the Rings, Tolkien imagined his angels not as some unknowable being, but as a person you'd enjoy sitting down with at the pub for a good smoke. Moreover, though his actions in the story are sometimes mysterious, there are other uses of magic we can indeed understand. This sets the stage for what became a theme of later epic fantasies: magic in the hands of the protagonists. Magic is a thing to learn and master in epic fantasy, a skill, an art, or even a science. In my lectures on the topic of magic, I make a point about the different effects a hard magic system and a soft magic system can have on a story. Hard magic, which the characters use as a tool, creates interesting pathways for problem solving. Costs can be weighed, benefits obtained, and skill or bravery exercised. Soft magic, conversely, keeps these rules, if there are any, hidden from the reader and from the character, and in so doing creates mystery, wonder, and sometimes terror. We can see Tolkien laying the model for this in Lord of the Rings. On one hand, we have Gandalf, friendly and allied, but also mysterious. When he uses his magic, he references a spell or the like, but we never are given the rules or methods he employs. Gandalf is a soft magic, though there are hints that if we fully dug into the Legendarium, we would understand, just like the fireworks he uses have their explanations. Indeed, I'll bet there are some in this audience, maybe not this one, maybe you, who could go into detail for us at length on how Gandalf does what he does. However, Tolkien uses Gandalf and others like Tom Bombadil to fulfill an effect of creating wonder, to full effect in creating wonder. The hobbits, and to extent the rest of the Mortal Fellowship, are to show how vast and deep the world is. There are things in it older than elves. Tolkien was, as we all know, a Beowulf scholar. It is no coincidence that The Hobbit and Beowulf both include a scene involving a thief stealing a golden cup from a dragon's hoard. Lord of the Rings is the what-if story of someone who isn't a traditional hero, striking out into a world pulled from Anglo-Saxon myth. To this end, magic and the world at large need to make the hobbits feel metaphorically small, not just literally. But then there's the ring. In the middle of all of this, the ring is put into the hands of the protagonist, and there is a hard magic system associated with it. Everyone who has read the book can exactly say what the ring can do, at least in Frodo's hands. It makes him invisible, but it makes the Eye of Sauron turn toward him. Cost, benefit. This hard magic system gives a tool of the enemy's own devising and puts it in the hands of the smallest and most weak of the Fellowship. With it, Frodo escapes Boromir, and Sam rescues his master from the orcs. It is a boon and a curse, for we see firsthand the corrupting influence it has, another quantifiable cost for using this magic. The hard magic of the ring, in contrast to the soft magic of Gandalf, serves a strong narrative function. When Gandalf uses his magic, we never know what the cost will be, but we feel wonder and sometimes uncertainty. When someone uses the ring, we get to see them solving narrative problems, but with a cost, for the best magic systems often have a cost. I don't think epic fantasy would be what it is today without both the ring and the sense of wonder in Lord of the Rings. It gives us epic scope while also retaining a personal use of the magic on an individual level. So that's innovation 2. Innovation 3 is mythological roots. This is one topic about Tolkien's work which has been analyzed by those who are far more versed in his oeuvre than I am. So we will touch upon it more lightly than we did the first 2 points. I believe one of the strongest innovations Tolkien made was one of extrapolation. He didn't just tell stories using direct Anglo-Saxon mythological parallels. He crafted for us this story that used unique races and lore. Elves in Tolkien are not elves seen anywhere else in mythology. Certainly there are hints of inspiration, but they are wholly his own creation. Likewise, orcs, dwarves, and even hobbits. In each way, these challenge perceptions as much as reinforce them. Elves might be aloof, but they aren't cruel. Dwarves do enjoy mining for gold, but they have a full society and are great builders as well. Orcs might be fearsome creatures of the night, but they're also fearsome warriors, not merely dangerous tricksters that will curdle your milk if you don't leave out an offering. In this, Tolkien didn't just mimic, he innovated. Conversely, However, Middle-earth isn't the generic medieval land that some later fantasy works used, as if a section of a theme park or a Renaissance fair where any gobbledygook from any time before the industrial era, from any culture, kingdom, or time is fair game. Middle-earth has a solid, profoundly strong aesthetic, consistent, built off of solid historical roots, used deliberately. Innovation 4, stakes. Tolkien, like his colleague C.S. Lewis, was not afraid of world-ending stakes in his stories, and this was to become a key component to epic fantasy as Tolkien created it. And this is part of where we get the epic in epic fantasy. While not all stories in this genre need to put the entire world in danger, it is commonly used as a way to distinguish it from heroic fantasy, which tends to focus more on personal stakes, like revenge. Lord of the Rings isn't just about the potential fall of the kingdom. It's about the potential fall of the world. The stakes being arguably, or the Silmarillion details threats to perhaps existence itself, the stakes being arguably a war for heaven and godhood. It is, on a more abstract level, a battle between philosophies. The honor and virtue of Aragorn as king, or the corruption and destruction of Sauron as king. Which lord will you follow? For most people, it's a given. But Tolkien, again, manages to make these stakes personal, as he did with the use of magic. And this is where Gollum is key. My mother is an accountant, and she loves accounting sort of things. Fantasy books aren't exactly her staple form of entertainment, but we, her children, dragged her to the Lord of the Rings films, as she was good-natured about letting us share this thing we loved with her. She really got into them, to the point that she was eager to join us for the third film. But it wasn't the battles that interested her, the political machinations, or even the story of Frodo and the Ring. She said, and I remember it distinctly, I need to find out if little Smeagol decides to be good or not. She also said, I need to know if Aragorn ends up with the pretty elf princess. These are what my mom was watching Lord of the Rings for. Stakes alone aren't enough to make a story work. It must be stakes mixed with a personal relationship to the characters living through those stakes. A story is only as thrilling as our worry for the people in it, and a magic is only as intriguing as our curiosity to its effects on the people we love. Gollum is, in this, one of the most important people in all of the story, because he lets us see the conflict between honor and greed on a personal level, as he struggled to decide which person he would be. The person Frodo saw in him, or the person the ring wanted him to become. Likewise, the stakes of a world ending only work because we care, and we cry, and we hurt as Sam carries Frodo up the mountain. Epic fantasy, then, is a conundrum. It is a story where often all the world is threatened, but we can't care about that so much as we care about a gardener who just wants to get home. Innovation 5, immersion. I've spent years searching for the first completely secondary world fantasy. For a while, I thought it was Lord Dunsany or George MacDonald, but I, like others, now believe it to be Phantasmion. However, the incredible idea here is that it doesn't seem to have happened much, if at all, before the 19th century. Having made a study on some of these early fantasies, I find them engaging and interesting, but not immersive. Phantasmion reads like something out of 1001 Nights. It has fantastical lands with interesting names, but doesn't seek to persuade us that they're real. More, they are presented as whimsical locations, not quite like our own. Many of the pre-Tolkien secondary world fantasies read this way, like a stroll through a fairy tale world. We can all agree that Middle-earth is different. It feels less like a land of imagination and more like a serious historical document from a world that never existed. Part of this is the use of the ephemera. The first thing you see when opening The Hobbit, for example, is a map, and not just any map, the exact map used in the book by the characters. This is one of my quibbles with the early days of my genre. Too many included maps merely because they were expected, with no reference to how or where this piece of arcana might have been used or obtained. Tolkien was painstaking in his efforts to make his work exude authenticity. There and back again in the Red Book of Westmarch, the manuscripts by Bilbo, Frodo, and Sam that Tolkien purportedly translated, give us a buffer in fantasy that we still use today. For those who don't know, Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit are presented in translation in English from original text. This isn't merely a fun affectation. It's necessary to give us a sense of plausibility for the text. Language is inherently anachronistic. Too many of our words are obtained from deeply earth-centric sources. This is most obvious to see manifest in poems, songs, and puns. If a character cracks a joke in a fantasy book and the joke depends on wordplay, are we to imagine the wordplay worked in their language the same way? The answer is that these things were filtered through a master translator in Tolkien, who created similar constructions in English that would convey the ideas that the characters were using. For instance, I don't know if you know this, Sam's name is not Sam. Who knew that? Sam's name is not Samwise. His name is Banazir. In the original world, his name was Banazir, but Tolkien said Banazir sounds exotic to us, right? But to them, it would sound rustic. And so he chose a name in English for Sam that evoked a homey feeling, the same way that if Aragorn met him would know, oh, this is someone from a rural area, not Banazir, which sounds exotic. He wanted to give us that same feel that the characters had. So he actually translated the names of the hobbits when he used them. You might say that we're overthinking this. If so, might I remind you that we regularly write 1,000-page novels about wizards. Overthinking things is the job. Moreover, this is an issue for some readers. They come and ask me questions about this. If I use the term hat trick in Mistborn, does it imply they have the same sports in their world that we do? The word coach, as in for a carriage, not a sports coach, comes from the name of a Hungarian city. If we use the word coach in a fantasy world, does that imply the existence of Hungary? These are sometimes amusing gotchas, but for some reason the questions are sincere because they want, when they're between the pages of an epic fantasy, to feel it is real. Immersion in our works is the key emotion people seek. They want to, for a time, go someplace new. Our world is largely explored, and space is, though exciting, beyond our reach. Yet humans want to trailblaze, to set foot in a place never before seen. They want to come to love characters and treat them as real, if only within the story. They want that sincerity that is our first point, and Tolkien reinforced it by being exhaustively particular about his sense of immersion. He was not the first to use ephemera, like I mentioned Dracula, but he was the first to take it this seriously. And the reason we continue to love it today is because of that attention to detail. The Lord of the Rings wasn't just a fantastic book series, it was a revolutionary restructuring of our understanding of what a story could be. He created, from a fusion of many previous stories, something new. Pounded and forged like the rings themselves, from ideas made alloy, given only the artistry and care that he could. Tolkien gave us epic fantasy, and I worry at first we didn't understand how to use it. What not to learn from Tolkien? Early in my career, I'd occasionally write an editorial on my blog relating to the fantasy genre. That was when I wrote the very first proto-version of what would become this lecture today. At the very least, this lecture consumed the best victuals of that one and left the bulk of its half-formed ideas to the vultures. It had a title that drew a lot of attention, more than I'd expected, and was my first experience with accidentally creating clickbait. That word didn't even exist back then, but I did it. To explain this essay in context, let me talk a little bit more about the history of fantasy. If there's an area of the history of fantasy genre where I'm approaching a scholarly level of experience, it's those first bestseller years, beginning in the 70s and ending in the late 90s. It began with Professor Tolkien passing away and ended with the publication of Harry Potter, 1973 to 1977. Roughly 25 years when epic fantasy emerged to become the dominant form of speculative fiction. This is when I discovered books, fell in love with reading, and determined myself to become an author. During these 25 years, science fiction took a backseat to fantasy for the first time in history, at least by sales. This correlates and likely in a meaningful way with the rise of the hardcover novel and the steady decline in sales of the pulp magazine. Science fiction has often been a stronger medium in the short form, but when it comes to the long form, and the really long form, fantasy, with its rich mythologies, intriguing political conflicts, and immersive worlds, was king, or emperor, or dark lord, or whatever you prefer. I remember well at the end of this sales boom. As I tried to publish in the early 2000s, I was forced to watch as many of our readers jumped to YA fantasy, something that always existed but rarely had been distinguished from what we now call middle grade. After this, they jumped to urban fantasy as Twilight gave it a renaissance. It would be a good decade before a Game of Thrones' similar premiere would skyrocket George to superstardom, though his book series was selling well. Yet it was a hybrid of genres, a story taking the grit, low magic, and lethal pessimism from urban fantasy, or heroic fantasy, and combining it with a more, that's a typo, with heroic fantasy, and combining it with a more epic fantasy-style plot. Beyond that, George had published the first of those in the mid-90s. It had been half a decade or more since he and Robin Hobb published their first entries, and I felt like in that time, nothing new had appeared. In truth, it had, but this was epic fantasy's first great struggle, the bust following the boom. Books were being published, but they weren't hitting the market as previous ones had. The Fifth Sorceress is the highest profile flop among these, but there were others. Stephen Erickson is the lone bright spot in a sea of disappointing sales, save for the old standby authors, who continued to do well by momentum. Even Erickson had difficulty in the market for his first few books, though that is likely related to publishing quirks of how his books were released. I think a lot of this was due to one fundamental problem, that of copying Tolkien instead of learning from him. My early essay, the one with the clickbait title I began talking about earlier, was titled something along the lines of How Tolkien Ruined Fantasy.
Oh no.
My central thesis was this. Tolkien was so far ahead of his time, so brilliant in his execution, that nobody quite knew how to follow him up. So they just tried to do what he did and copied his model a little too closely. I don't blame these authors. I think many of them are fantastic writers, and I'm glad they're part of our tradition. However, the genre as a whole didn't learn the lessons of Tolkien's 5 innovations, most specifically the last one, immersion. Instead of realizing that by drawing upon mythological roots to create sincere and powerful works, original and full of wonder, they learned that a story with elves, dwarves, and a quest for a magical object is how you write fantasy. The problem with this only became manifest in the late 90s, when readers started to experience something concerning. Many of them talked to me when I was breaking it about how they slowly fell out of love with fantasy because it was no longer giving them what it used to. They came looking for wonder, exploration, and immersion. They weren't getting it because a lot of the worlds felt the same and the stories repetitive. You'll notice, by the way, since I'm speaking at JordanCon, that Robert Jordan had to evolve out of the quest fantasy before he became a superstar with book 4. Books 1, 2, and 3 did well, but it's when he was one of those that led the innovation along with George of turning epic fantasy into a political drama instead of a traditional quest fantasy. We as a genre got there eventually. We learned there is more to learn. It says that right now, I'll change it later. We learned there's more to learn than learning from Tolkien than merely imitating him. I hope we can continue to learn these lessons. Now, do not mark me as criticizing anything that anyone wants to write or read. This is a wide open genre, the most open that any can be. There is plenty of room for classical Tolkien-inspired worlds in this genre. It's merely best if we offer a variety of places to explore, from a variety of diverse roots and narrative traditions, so that we preserve that feeling of exploration and innovation. Conclusion, why fantasy? And this part isn't finished yet, so I'm just going to talk it through to you. So, as we come to the end here, there's a personal story I want to share with you. And this has happened to me a couple times, so the one I'm going to share is I was at a signing. It was actually at a Costco, of all places. They had me in once. I don't know why. They just did. And I'm sitting there doing signings, and a mother had brought her young daughter. The young daughter was super excited, got her book signed, and then kind of wandered off. And the mother leaned into me, and she said, "No offense, but why does she only read this fantasy crap?" Yeah. She said it to me as if saying, "I know that you could write anything that you want, but you write this because the masses like it," or something like that. She thought she was not insulting me somehow, right? She's like, "Why fantasy? Why do you write this?" And this obviously was a bit insulting, in part because we don't ask, why the Mona Lisa, right? When it comes to visual art, we never ask, why did they paint that? They painted it because it's art, and you paint art and you express yourself. But I get this question a lot. I got it in Dubai when I was at the book festival there. They had a quote-unquote serious author there who asked me, it's like, why would you waste your time with this? I get asked why fantasy a lot. And you can perhaps see, after getting asked this so often, why I so love on fairy stories, where Tolkien, that nobody can point to him and say he isn't a serious writer, defended it. Why fantasy? Why do we write it? What is it? I've approached it in this, right? It's exploration, it's wonder, it's beauty. But also, I think there's something more. Fantasy is the genre of the possible. It is the genre, therefore, of a better future. We don't write about the past with fantasy. It's something people make a mistake about. We write about the now, and we write about our aspirations. We use fantasy aesthetic to separate it from our world so we can explore these ideas in a way that just divorces them from some of their baggage. Because of this, we are actually hopefully writing about the future with fantasy, which seems like a contradiction. But if you think about it, nothing wonderful has happened in this world without somebody first imagining it possible, right? Whether you look at scientific discoveries, imagining that people could fly, which was absolutely not possible for most of humankind's history, whether you look at social advances of racial equality and things like this, nothing has been achieved if someone didn't dare to imagine it being possible. And when I read a fantasy book, when I explore one of these worlds, on one hand, I love that it just takes me a new place. I love the immersion. I love all of that. But it does something else. It is exercises for our imagination. It helps us to imagine a better world. I became a reader of fantasy, not because I picked up a book of dragons. I picked it up because there were dragons. I stayed because it taught me something interesting about my mother. And you can find me talking about that other places, but I felt reading about a woman who was middle-aged, struggling with her career and her family, that I understood my mom, and I had a fantastic story about dragons. That's why fantasy. Because a great fantasy book can do everything any other genre does. You will find literary fiction as quote-unquote serious in fantasies you'll find anywhere else. You'll find a mystery as powerful. A romance is great. You will find all of this while exploring, becoming more imaginative, and you can have dragons too. So why not fantasy? Thank you. Thank you for putting up with that. I know that's more scholarly than you perhaps expected coming here, but that's what I'm going to do at Oxford. Hopefully I will be able to get all of those kinks worked out. If you are a scholar of Tolkien or fantasy and you notice I got something wrong, please drop me an email through my website and just say, Brandon asked for this. They'll get it to me. All right. Thank you, guys.